Hey everybody. So today we're going to talk about burnishing the edges of your leather. We're going to show you how to do a very simple utilitarian burnish that will seal up your edges, make everything look really nice. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to cut this in half and just glue it together like any other piece of leather. As it's a sample, I'm not going to bother stitching it, but this would represent a stitched piece of leather. And I'm purposely not going to have perfect edges because part of this is making sure your edge is nice and straight. So we're going to go through trimming your edges, sanding everything down to make sure that everything is nice and even. So once you have whatever you're making glued together, and it might be thinner than this. This is 2 5-ounce pieces of leather so that we can show it on camera. The first step in getting a good edge is trimming. If it's a wallet, if it's a bag, whatever you're doing, you might want to leave some seam allowance, because what that allows you to do is take your piece and trim it. And it's very hard when you're gluing things together to get a perfect seam. So by leaving some seam allowance, you can trim off that outer edge and cut everything at once, and that's a good foundation for a nice, clean, burnished edge. And so now once you have your edges trimmed square, you can go in and lay your stitch line down if you're stitching, which you probably are. If this is a belt and you're not stitching, no worries. But if it's a wallet, odds are that you're going to be laying a stitch line. And you want to trim everything square if you're using a divider to mark your stitch line, because if everything is jagged, your stitch line is going to be jagged. After you do that, and say you've stitched already, the next thing we need to do is we need to round these edges. And the reason that we're going to round these edges or bevel them is because if we were to burnish just like this, what would happen over time is that these hard right-angled edges would bend over, they would get all scraggly, they might tear. So we're going to use what's called an edge beveler. This is Weaver's size 0 edge beveler. There are many sizes of edge bevelers, and the size indicates just how much is going to be taken off of this square edge. I like to use the 0 for pretty much everything because I like to have a flat seam. But if you want a more aggressively rounded edge, you can use 1, 2, 3, however large of a beveler that you want. So all you do is we're going to take our beveler and we're just going to run it down one edge, and then we're going to run it down the other. And this is kind of junky leather, so if that happens, you can kind of go backwards and get those little bits. But, like I said, this is from the scrap bin. I wouldn't be using this leather for a wallet, so we'll focus on this side. So we started out with a square edge, right? When we beveled, what we did was we took off our corners, so we have kind of 45-degree angles. Now you can go straight to burnishing if you'd like after that, but if our goal is to have a nice rounded edge, we have more of this angle to take off. And we're going to do that with various grits of sandpaper. So I have 220 grit sandpaper, and I think this is either 400 or 600 grit sandpaper. And like everything, you can go as detailed as you want in this. You can start with a little bit of a heavier grit, and you can really sand down. You can polish up to like 1,000 grit, and you almost start to burnish at that point before you even bring in cloth or a slicker or anything like that. What I like to do is on veg tan, and it's important to note that this method is pretty much just for vegetable tan leathers. You can do it with some latigos too, but when you get into the aniline dyed leathers, those are much harder to burnish naturally like this. You more or less have to go with edge paints and that sort of thing. They just don't have the ability to burnish. So I'm going to take the 220 grit, and I'm just going to start sanding lightly. Now, leather sand's really easy. It's not like wood. You can see I'm already taking off a bunch of material. And I like to use my hands for this because your finger kind of forms to the natural curve of the edge of the leather and helps you get a nice round profile. And some people will only go one direction. I think it has to do with the grain of the leather. I've always just gone back and forth. Leave in the comments if you know exactly why and why that's important. We're always open to learning ourselves as well. And so once we get that sort of 45-degree edge knocked down a bit, and we brush this off. Then we go in with our lighter grit sandpaper. 400 or 600 works great. And I'm going to do the same thing. And an important thing when you're doing this is you want to make sure that you're being careful to not wrap the sandpaper over, because if you sand the face of your leather, that's kind of a ruined piece. So you want to be careful, and you get the hang of it fairly quickly. It only takes a couple times doing that to learn to not do it. And you'll notice when you get your fine grit sandpaper, it starts to feel a little bit more burnished. And this really helps once we get to the water or gum trag or saddle soap stage, to not only cut down on labor, but to make a much more silky smooth seam. So once you're sanded down, you're going to need a burnishing agent of some sort. We like to use gum trag. That's what's in this little cup here. We buy it in gigantic jugs because we go through it. You can also use just simple water. You can use saddle soap, you can use toconol, you can use all sorts of different things. And what we're going to do is we're going to apply this stuff to our edge before we slick the edge down. And it's going to make it go nice and easy and give us a nice shine. So all I'm going to do, I use my finger. You can use a dauber or something like that, but I just use my finger and I put a little bit on the edge. And in my experience, if you're using gum trag, you don't want to go right into slicking it down. You want to let it kind of like tacks up a little bit. And you want to let it dry up just a little bit, because if it's totally wet and you go to slick it or use your cloth or whatever, it kind of just mushes it around. It needs to be at the point where it's about to dry, and that's how you get your good burnish. The next step, you have choices. You can go straight to cloth. If you've done a really good job sanding down your edges, you can just go in with a cloth. This is just canvas. You can use denim as well, and you're just gonna burnish back and forth, and you'll start to see it shine up. If you have a little bit of a rougher leather, you can use some sort of wood or bone. Honestly, you can get a slicker. If I have to do this, which I don't actually do this often because I usually take the time to sand, I prefer that. A tool handle does the job. And again, you're just gonna burnish back and forth, and this will slick it down. I find that it's much more difficult to get a good shine with a wooden slicker. I'll start with a wooden slicker, but I generally always finish with canvas. So if you have to re-apply this to your edges because they get too dry, that's cool. And then sometimes I'll just wipe some of it off if it's a second application. Let it dry a little bit. So we've slicked with our wood. Now we're gonna go in with our canvas, and we're just gonna burnish. And if you watch, and you feel this too, it starts off with kind of some resistance, and as it burnishes, you'll feel that start to slick up. One of the old leather workers that taught me at an old leather shop in Connecticut when I was starting, he called it polishing the bowling alley. He said, I've never polished bowling alley, but apparently he had, and he said it was similar. Now hopefully you can see we're starting to get that shine in there. And the mechanism, what's happening here is that the heat from the friction is drawing oils from inside the leather to the surface. And that's sealing up this edge. Because if you make something out of leather and you have the grain side facing out, anything that tries to penetrate this isn't going to be able to. But on the edge, this is open fiber. So for example, if this was a wallet and you get some water on it, it's gonna dampen this a little bit, but it's gonna sink very far into those fibers if this isn't sealed. And what can happen is if you have a stitch line right here and you're using, say, a linen thread, you can start to actually rot your stitch line. It makes your stitching, it weakens your stitch line. And it also has the ability to start mold, because remember, leather's natural material. So it's important to seal up these open edges, because otherwise you're just creating opportunity for issues to arise down the road. So our last step is we're going to seal with beeswax. And this is actually some beeswax that Kaylina, who's behind the camera right now, her mom, this comes from her mom's bees. So all you do is you just kind of apply some beeswax. You can go one way, you can go both ways. Now that that's on there, I go back with my canvas and I just give it one last burnish. And this feels similar to when you're burnishing the first time. It'll start kind of bumpy because you just put a bunch of beeswax on, but as you heat it up with the friction of burnishing, it'll start to smooth out and then it'll polish up. And then you have pretty much your finished seam. So let's talk about options, because that's a lot of work for every individual piece if you are doing volume. This is Weaver's, I think they call it their Power Edge Slicker by Master Tools. This one I've had in my shop for 8 years. We use it every single day, and I'm going to be honest with you, I have never maintained a single thing in this. I'm pretty sure I should have, but I haven't. It still works great. This is a way to speed up that process. You have a sanding drum here, you have an edge slicker here, and all you do is you flip the switch, and this is your manpower. Your movement here is your manpower. So on my other side of this little sample here, I've cut my edge flat again, and I'm going to show you how much quicker this goes when you're using a tool like this, which is the only electricity powered tool in our entire workshop, but it's well worth it because it is able to give you the same result as doing this by hand in a fraction of the time, which is a great way to lower the price of your products for your customers without lowering any of the quality at all. So first you turn on, and then you sand. And the great thing about this tool when you're using a drum sander like this is if you want to make a curved corner, say you have a die that's a square corner and you want to round it just a little bit, you don't have to hand cut everything. You can go through and cut 45s, and with this drum sander, your 45s in a fraction of a minute become nice curved edges. So the next step, once you've sanded this down initially, is you go through with your beveler, and you can kind of see that there's like a mushroomed out edge here. We're going to remove that, and then we're going to apply some gum trag, and then we're going to go and we're going to do our first burnish on the wooden burnishing part of this tool. And because we have machine power behind this one, I found that it's not as important to sand down this 45, because the way that you work on this machine is you start from the biggest and you move down to the smallest notch that you can as you're burnishing. And what that does is it sort of naturally rounds this over. By hand, it's a lot more difficult to do that. So we're going to show you, I'm going to turn this on, and we're going to go all the way down the line. Once we have our burnish, we still want to seal it with wax, but when you're doing volume and you have this machine to use, what I like to do is there are two fairly large notches here, and to be honest with you, we never make anything or burnish anything that's this large. So I take some beeswax and I actually apply it to this large notch. And all you do you just turn your machine on, hold the wax into the notch, and the wax will stick. Next, we're just going to turn the machine on, and we run our edge down the wax part first, and then we go back to one of our notches and smooth it out. And usually the wax doesn't get into any of these notches because it's stuck firmly on the leather. It just smooths it out just like we did with the canvas. And so there we go. You can see, I don't know if the camera picks it up, but you can see that the machine burnished edge is a little bit darker than the hand burnished edge. And the reason for that is because of the amount of friction. The more friction you apply, the darker this edge is going to get. It's almost like a burning, which leads me to kind of the last point. All of this burnishing edges, all of this is trial and error. As you develop your style, it's important that you try things like water burnishing, you try burnishing with canvas and with wood, and just see what you like best. Because there are a lot of different styles. You might choose to dye your edges before you burnish them for that really Western look. That's beautiful as well. All of this is different. The most important thing is that you just want to make sure that you're getting a good seal. It's an important step to take after doing all the hard work of making a piece to ensure that that piece that you make and all of your hard work lasts as long as it possibly can. And so that's about it, guys. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let us know in the comments. We've been having a lot of fun doing these skill videos, so let us know what else you'd like to see from us, and we'll see you in the next one.